Some folks have the kind of jobs that meant they had to keep showing up and dealing with other people, even when they would have preferred to stay home and be isolated. Other people chose to take more risks than others, choosing connection over caution. And some were much quicker to re-enter the social world as things eased than others. But all of us experienced, to different degrees, a changed rhythm to our lives, reduced options, and more limited connections with other human beings. And now we have largely found our way back to community, back to relationship, back to gatherings, back to normal. And for some, that journey has been easy and joyful. And for others, it's a little harder than we expected it to be. So I need to acknowledge that there's a piece of me that's a little bit ambivalent about being here, because as much as I am delighted to have the chance to reconnect with this community, I'm still a little edgy about being in groups in enclosed spaces. And I'm exquisitely aware that that is now very much a minority position to be in. Now, we've all had different responses to the shift back to normal life. Some folks felt able to leave the pandemic behind them right away. They were ready to throw away the masks and start dining out and doing karaoke in crowded bars. It was the most extreme example I could think of. Mosh pits, maybe. Some folks were ready quickly to gather with their families and their close friends, but still continued to mask in or maybe avoid indoor crowds and work through a risk assessment process for each new activity. We recently visited some old friends who agreed that they still have trouble imagining that they could ever again feel comfortable in a setting like a crowded gym for a spin class with everybody breathing hard. They couldn't imagine ever again in their life thinking that would be a safe thing to do. And they've largely let go of pandemic precautions, but some things just are still a bridge too far. Now, in our household, we have some significant immune issues. And so I am still rocking my N95s when I go indoors in public places, unless I can keep my distance like I can in the pulpit. But increasingly, I am the only person wearing a mask, and I've started to get some looks and the occasional eye roll. It seems that a lot of people who are done with the pandemic think the rest of us should be done with it too. And I find myself feeling really defensive. I want to go and talk to those people and say, hey, look, this is not a political statement, okay? It's not a judgment on you. I'm really happy for you that you've been able to move on, but this is about my immune-compromised family member. So please try to understand. I don't do that. I just try to ignore the eye rolls, but I want to do that. And noticing those reactions, the reactions people have to me and the reactions I have to their reactions to me, has helped me realize how much the pandemic has highlighted something that was absolutely true even before the pandemic. And that is our tendency to very quickly pigeonhole one another on the basis of very limited information. We are so good at snap judgments. Small symbols become indicators of what side a person is on. Mask or no mask. American flag on the pickup truck. Hate has no home here sign in the front yard. Or don't blame me, I voted for Trump. Black Lives Matter lapel pin. Or one that says, gun rights are women's rights. I'm still trying to figure that one out. One look, and we think we know everything we need to know about another person. Now, one of my guilty secrets is that I love reading mysteries and watching detective series on television. Deep, profound reading matter and watching matter, isn't it, for a pastor? And one of the reasons that I love them so much is that it's usually really easy to tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and to know which side to be on. And that kind of certainty is very comforting. It's that feeling of knowing the answers and being pretty sure that there's going to be a good outcome. But that kind of certainty is a fallacy. The story this morning is a reminder to me that the answers are not usually quite so clear-cut. The answer is often under construction, no matter what the question might be. And our work is to get underneath the code words and the symbols that we think tell us so much about each other and search for the deeper truths. Now, I stumbled across an article last fall that lifts up what a deep and urgent need this more complex kind of thinking is in our culture right now. And it offers a strategy for how to go about the hard work of going deeper. The article was in the Hedgehog Review, and it's by Alan Levinovitz. He's a professor in the Philosophy and Religion Department at James Madison University. And it caught my eye at first simply because of the title, In Praise of Bewilderment. Because I thought finally someone was affirming my natural condition. I spend much of my life feeling bewildered. Levinovitz begins by saying, there is hope for America's ailing soul. It draws on a standard teaching technique familiar to anyone reading these words, bewilderment. And then he goes on to describe the process he uses in order to get his questions to his students to question their assumptions and recognize the complexity of the issues that they're studying. They start out absolutely certain, for example, that science and religion are utterly incompatible. Two completely separate ways of knowing the world. It's one or the other, no common ground. His students are certain of this. But he says, when someone is certain, it's very hard to learn. So I begin with bewilderment. Are you familiar with Gregor Mendel, the 19th century Roman Catholic friar, whose mathematical acumen and love of biology gave us the earliest known laws of genetic heredity? Did you know Sir Isaac Newton wrote much more about religion and astrology, no, not astronomy, astrology, than about physics? Maybe you find history dull. Then consider Dr. Francis Collins, former director of the National Institutes of Health, leader of the Human Genome Project, and avowed evangelical Christian. He finds that his students at first resist this kind of exploration, but he meets their arguments with counter-arguments until they are deep into the complexities of the interplay between science and religion. And he says, eventually, if we're lucky, we achieve bewilderment. Fine, what is the relationship between religion and science? And there, in the space created by uncertainty and ambiguity, learning can begin. That space is humble, open, flexible. My students discover that I'm right there in it with them. I don't have the answers either. We work together, think things through, and as in any good class, we emerge changed, not validated. I want to read that again. Eventually, if we're lucky, we achieve bewilderment. Fine. What is the relationship between religion and science? And there, in the space created by uncertainty and ambiguity, learning can begin. That space is humble, open, flexible. My students discover that I'm right there in it with them. I don't have the answers either. We work together, think things through, and as in any good class, we emerge changed, not validated. Now, I have to admit that this leads to a second reason that I feel a little ambivalent about standing here before you this morning, because I am preaching yet another sermon about something that I think is really important and rarely managed to put into practice, which leaves me feeling like a bit of a hypocrite. Maybe one of the hardest things about writing sermons is the way it constantly reminds me of the chasm between who I am in my day-to-day life and who I aspire to be in my day-to-day life. I am often not willing to enter that space of ambiguity and uncertainty that Levinovitz describes, where learning can take place. If I'm really honest, I'm more interested in having people recognize the validity of where I'm coming from, to realize that I'm right. But Levinovitz is absolutely right. That makes it very hard for me to learn. Now, the illustration that he used about religion and science was especially helpful to me, and it led me to my choice of reading for this morning. As many of you probably know, Robert Ingersoll was an American lawyer, writer, and orator in the mid to late 1800s, who was known as the Great Agnostic, and who wrote volumes defending and extolling the agnostic worldview. A lot of Unitarians revere Robert Ingersoll. I discovered him when I was in college, and I devoured his writing. I was deeply moved by his ability to claim the power of mystery and awe without also buying into any kind of religious belief. His views were far more radical in his day, of course, than they seem to us now, or even when I stumbled across them in the early 1980s. But I felt so validated by his vehemence. Let us have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know, music to a defiant atheistic young Unitarian's ears. But over time, as I have become more open to the beauty and power of many religious systems, I have come to hear some echoes of arrogance in Ingersoll's words. We are the courageous ones. We have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know. The rest of you are too timid and dishonest to admit it and cling instead to your ridiculous belief systems. I mean, I do think that's the underlying message in Robert Ingersoll. You know, those of us who are enlightened enough realize that we don't know. But maybe he didn't mean it quite so judgmentally. Maybe he simply was trying to hold up an alternative possibility. And certainly for me as a young adult, Ingersoll opened a door that allowed me to claim a commitment to rationalism while also claiming the beauty and wonder and mystery of the world, which I consider religious in its nature, and which then allowed me later to open a door to things that perhaps Ingersoll would have wished I wouldn't open the door to. He may have been the gateway drug for me, a bridge in his own way between science and religion. But I wanted to use his words for another reason as well, as a cautionary tale, because I'm often struck by the way we Unitarian Universalists, who put such an emphasis on being willing to admit that we don't know when it comes to theology, tend to be extremely sure that we do know when it comes to pretty much everything else. We have done this consistently, even within our own movement. In fact, within our own movement, we have done it about theology, about the right way not to know. The early Unitarians ostracized the transcendentalists when they began to emerge. Then we had a long stretch where the humanists and the theists were deking it out over who had the right to be here. You Christians still often feel marginalized. I can speak personally to that one. And we do the same thing with our social issues, digging in our heels, not only about the right causes to embrace, but also about the specific methodology that must be used in order to address those causes. We don't seem to have much capacity for bewilderment because we are so sure that we are right. Now, Levinovitz starts his article by affirming that bewilderment provides hope for America's ailing soul. So clearly he believes that we need to bring this kind of openness and humility into public dialogue of all kinds. He acknowledges that it's hard and scary to move into that state of bewilderment, to be less sure that we know what we think we know. But he argues the resulting worldview is more useful and more beautiful because it genuinely reflects reality. That's why a synonym for bewilderment is wonder, which at least for me, he says, is not terrifying, but exhilarating. Now, I really like wonder as a synonym for bewilderment. It's got a more positive spin to it, for one thing. My sister told me years ago that when she comes up against someone whose worldview is really different from her own, in an uncomfortable way, she tries to approach them with an attitude of witness and wonder. Witness, pay attention in a serious way to what the person is really saying and thinking. And then wonder. Try to imagine where those thoughts and ideas might be coming from, why the person feels as they do. Now, trying to understand definitely does not mean we necessarily end up agreeing. And Levinovitz is really clear that we shouldn't always agree. Allowing bewilderment to infuse our approach to an issue, he says, does not mean we cannot have strong beliefs. We will still have big differences of opinion on all kinds of issues. We'll still need to take stands. But he argues, if we can bring some of that sense of bewilderment into a conversation with someone who disagrees with us, then he says, the conversation turns into a dialogue instead of an argument. We make progress instead of war. Now, Levinovitz is talking about big issues, religion and science, abortion, politics at every level. He sees us as a nation heading in the wrong direction, toward more and more certainty and rigidity on both sides of every issue. And he argues that we can buck that trend if we cultivate bewilderment in ourselves and by our own example, encourage its cultivation in others. Now, I think this is a big ask because so often I assume that the person on the other side is not going to meet me halfway in that vulnerable space. I may open up into a willingness to be bewildered and confront an absolute unwillingness to be bewildered. It feels very risky to cede any ground to those people and their ideas. I often will feel under threat. I think many of us tend to feel under threat, and so we dig in our heels and defend our side as the right side. But as I look around, I have to ask myself, how is that working for us really? Where is it getting us? Now, Levinovitz uses the metaphor of spandex to illustrate the way that bewilderment functions in public dialogue. Think about how clothing is more flexible and resilient, able to accommodate different shapes when you add a little spandex. As he says, you can still squat without ripping your pants. That's how bewilderment benefits culture. He says, the fabric of our society is increasingly inflexible, brittle, fragile. Our rigid ideologies are ready to crack under the slightest pressure. But this is a democracy, and we can fight against the inertia of tyrannical certainty, one person at a time. We can cultivate bewilderment in ourselves, and by our own example, encourage its cultivation in others. We can admit with the relief of honesty that some questions are genuinely difficult. We can reject the rigid binaries forced upon us by a sense of crisis. And we can recognize that our resistance to doing so isn't in the service of making progress, but rather a way of protecting ourselves. And then he says, I have hope for our collective soul, which, if we have the courage, can stretch and change instead of tearing itself apart. Well, I would certainly rather see us stretch and change than tear ourselves apart. And if it feels too daunting to jump right into this discipline of bewilderment when facing the great chasms in our culture, the good news is that you have plenty of room to practice right here. I often find myself ending sermons by saying, and if that feels too big, look around you and start smaller for practice. Because in my experience, it's hard enough to cultivate that attitude of witness and wonder, even among the people I'm closest to, the ones I respect and appreciate. Even in a community like this that defines itself by its common values, we hold a wide range of experiences and perspectives. Whether it's where we are on pandemic precautions or personal theology or a variety of personal and social issues, we have plenty of differences among us, and we can be quick to take sides and judge each other. If there's any hope of our learning to enter a state of bewilderment with folks who are very different from us, it lies in our learning right here to witness and wonder among ourselves, to meet differences with curiosity rather than judgment, to be less sure that we know the answer is yes or the answer is no, and to realize that perhaps the answer is under construction and we need to find a way to build it together. So I invite you to join me in search of and in praise of bewilderment. Let us at least sometimes have the courage and the candor to say, we do not know, and really mean it. And then perhaps we can begin to learn.